Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. It is a great pleasure for me today to introduce Elisa Silva. We are not only from the same country, but I've known her over several years since we were together in Rome in 2005-06. Elisa is director and founder of Enlace Arquitectura, which was established in Caracas, Venezuela in 2007, the year after she came back from Rome. Her work there focuses on raising awareness of spatial inequality and the urban environment through public space, the integration of informal settlements, and community engagement in rural landscapes. She not only makes wonderful designs and physical interventions for which she has won many awards, but she has also crafted a set of participatory methodologies that have to do with educating the public about design that have been key to Enlace's practice and were recently featured in the 20th Architecture and Urbanism Biennale in Valparaiso, Chile in 2017. The office has also been recognized in other international design awards, such as the 22nd Ibero-American Biennale of Architecture and Urbanism for the Sabana Grande Pavement Project in Caracas, and the WALK 21 Award for Puerto Encantado Higuerote Venezuela in 2015. Her research interests include the relationship of informal settlement growth with housing policy and land regulation, the role of public space in urban integration, and the adaptation of rural communities in landscapes. In 2017, she was awarded a Graham Foundation grant for the publication of Pure Space, expanding the public sphere through public space transformations in Latin American informal settlements, which will be published by ACTAR next year. She has co-authored Pro-Inclusion, Practical Tools for the Integral Development of Latin American Cities, published by the CAF, Development Bank of Latin America, in 2016, and presented at Habitat 3 in Quito. And she's also the author of a fantastic book that I have upstairs, Cartography of the Caracas Barrios, 1966-2014, by the Fundación Espacio, which is really a fantastic contribution to the city's records of urban history. Elisa was awarded the Wheelwright Fellowship in 2011, and as I mentioned, the Rome Prize in 2005. She received her MArch from the GSD in 2002, and right now she is teaching an option studio in the Department of Landscape Architecture, titled The Agency of Mezcal in the Oaxaca Valley, Mexico. Please join me in welcoming Elisa Silva.
Thank you, Anita, and thank you very much for this invitation. I'll get right to it. During the mid-20th century, Venezuela's income drastically increased with oil production. A junta government led by Marcos Pérez Jiménez was eager to quickly and drastically reshape the country and its capital into bastions of modernity and progress. Caracas was a city of construction sites and cranes. A handful of buildings are enough to illustrate the hubris and ambition attached to this nation-building effort. The Humboldt Tower and the cable car essentially conquered the Avila Mountain. Built in 1956, it was designed by architect José Tomás Sanabria, a luxury hotel, with covered swimming pool, casino, bar, restaurant, and ballroom. Ironically restored recently with state funds, and I say ironically because there seem to be other more pressing issues that require resources at this time in Venezuela. Other examples include the Central University by Carlos Raúl Villanueva, a 1953 400-acre modern campus and now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The Simón Bolívar Center by Cipriano Domínguez, completed in 1954, 103-meter-tall twin towers that were the tallest buildings in Venezuela at the time. The Helicoide, designed by architect Romero Gutierrez and financed through real estate speculation, had the audacity to mold a mountain and shape it into an ascending helix to serve as a linear shopping mall. Construction came to a halt in 1958 after the ousting of the nation-building dictator. Today, it is the headquarters of SEBIN, the equivalent to Venezuela's CIA, where many of the most prominent political prisoners are currently held. And lastly, a 4-lane freeway financed by the Rockefellers not only sanctified Caracas as a car city, but also ended its relationship with the river and completely transformed the axial center of the valley. These are all widely praised exemplars of a modern architecture and infrastructure that were enviable to the eyes of the world at the time. These and other works were very prominently featured in the exhibition Latin America in Construction at MoMA in 2016, and are celebrated as testimonials of a glorious past, with nostalgia and longing. There's also another story, one far less acknowledged, that nonetheless transpired in parallel all along these years. Informal settlements in Caracas grew at a much faster rate than the rest of the city. Already in 1966, they covered 17% of the urban territory. In 1984, 36% of the population lived in them. Today, the percentage has increased to half. Here we can see maps of how the territory grew in 4 distinct years, 1966, 1984, 2000, and 2014, and a consolidated map of the informal settlements in Caracas, which is part of the GABA research and publication Anita mentioned that Enlace took on between 2012 and 2014. Oil production, which began in the 20s and significantly increased in the 50s, created a large industrial and service sector to support the oil economy that motivated migration towards cities. At the same time, agricultural production, mainly in the form of coffee plantation, was in decline as markets in Brazil and Colombia had become more competitive and were arguably producing better quality beans. So even though oil production is often blamed for the ruin of agriculture in the country, this isn't entirely true. In Caracas, the informal settlements grew as a result of migration on the hills that surround the city. In other words, they were always visible and in plain sight. This is an aerial image of Cota 905 in Caracas, where you can see El Helicoide in the far distance, sort of over there, and the towers of Parque Central built in 1970. So why is it that it was so hard to read this urban narrative, even though it was constantly revealing itself? The Caracas barrios are what I call an urban Cassandra that disclosed the social inequality growing within the city and was crying for attention. Cassandra was the daughter of the king of Troy. Apollo fell madly in love with her and conferred on her the gift of prophecy. Cassandra, however, did not correspond to his advances, and so Apollo, in revenge, condemns her to continue seeing the future, but without anyone believing her. In fact, Cassandra predicted the fall of Troy. But her warnings were not taken in earnest, and so the prophecy unfolds just the same. In Jungian psychology, the figure of Cassandra is used to describe the human conscious, capable of formulating warnings and protecting us from suffering. The figure of Apollo represents the alter ego that resorts to denial and discrediting of our conscious as a mechanism of escape and evasion. And this appropriation of the myth by psychology describes very clearly what happened in Caracas. While informal settlements grew at a rate 2.5 times faster than its formal counterpart, both the government and the private sector preferred to deny it or continue believing that economic bonanza of oil would effortlessly resolve it, ignoring the growth of a deep social discontent that was the perfect brew for ensuing populist movements that would later emerge. In 1988, the Caracazo ignited a massive popular protest, mainly among people living in barrios, against higher gasoline prices and higher public transportation costs. A military takeover of the streets to quell the related looting resulted in hundreds of deaths and thousands injured. Hugo Chavez first attempted to enter into power by force in 1992 and then succeeded through elections in 1999. He cultivated and institutionalized this discontent, and the rest is now history. Just as Troy fell, Venezuela has also fallen, but not without the Cassandras that clearly forewarned it. Although we commonly associate inequity with the distribution of income and economic opportunities, it is also evident in the built environment. And this is especially true in the developing world, or the global south, visibly illustrated in the form of informal settlements. Even though informal settlements are often touted for their entrepreneurial and creative capabilities, although this may be true, we should be wary of such impromptu, redemptive arguments, which could be seen as a romantic, evasive, and simply not very useful way of dealing with the effects of such disparity. Informal settlements reinforce inequality by perpetuating urban exclusion and difference. Public transportation, public services, access to education and health, and human development opportunities are categorically different for people who live in an informal settlement versus those who live in the planned segments of a city. In Caracas, for example, the population density within barrios, and this is a map of the densities, and barrios is how informal settlements are called in Caracas or in Venezuela, is between 3 and 4 times greater than that of their formal neighbors. So informal settlements are a lot more dense than the rest of the city. Density of the 5 municipalities in Caracas is starkly different when one compares formal and informal segments. So this is divided into the 5 municipalities. El Hatillo is this one down here, is 5 times denser in its informal settlement, which is right around there, than the surrounding planned urban areas. Sucre, which is this municipality here, Petare is a very famous barrio, is 3 times more dense than its formal neighbors. This density, however, is not complemented by higher endowments of public space, and you can see the darker parts are the barrios, and it's just because they're denser. Public spaces and their accessibility do not include them, nor urban services such as transportation, and you'll see all the lines kind of run short before they meet the barrios. And the limited access to opportunities repeats cycles of poverty and creates a fertile ground for young men to choose life projects associated with criminal gangs as a way to find the companionship they lack at home, and their female counterparts seek early pregnancies to be recognized as mothers and acquire status in the community. Territorial inequality is ubiquitous and affects a significant portion of the world's population. Informal settlements are endemic to urban centers in emerging countries, where the majority of people reside. In some cases, as in Caracas, up to half of the citizens live in informal settlements, while in some African cities, the proportion rises to 80. These are maps of informal settlements in cities we surveyed as part of a study, Pro Inclusión, for CAF. So Rio de Janeiro, Panama, Fortaleza, Caracas, Guayaquil, Medellin, and Valparaiso. According to the United Nations, since 2003, 1/6 of the population, that is 1 billion people, live in informal settlements, and they estimate the number will double by 2030. The size of this figure is startling. How has this challenge been approached? The discourse of modern architecture and urban design has championed social housing to mitigate social inequality, and continues to do so. Although it is a well-intentioned approach, alone it does not help improve urban differences and inequality. Crucial to the reduction of inequality is the degree of integration that can be forged between diverse social segments, and this depends on a set of factors that include geographical proximity, access to amenities, and opportunities for citizens. And this is something Henry Lefebvre was already prescribing as he observed emerging slum areas in the Paris banlieues of 1968. After many decades of social housing production, both in Latin America and the rest of the world, we have not really seen significant progress in reducing urban inequality. Early modern architecture examples include the residential project El Silencio, built in 1943, and 23 de Enero, built in 1958, both in Caracas, by Carlos Raúl Villanueva as the designer. Mario Pani's Presidente Alemán Center in Mexico City, 1948, and Residencia San Felipe in Lima, Peru, by Enrique Siriani and others, 1962 to 69. This is a timeline of social housing projects in Latin America that Mariana Leguía in Lima elaborated for an edition of AD Magazine she curated in 2010. It begins with El Silencio project in Caracas, which is the one down over there. 1943, as the first social housing multifamily residential building, and progresses all the way to Aravena's project in Iquique, Chile. Beyond this timeline, into the last 8 years, social housing efforts continue to focus on the unit itself, with little regard to their location, which tends to be in distant peripheral urban areas where land is less expensive. These are images of recent social housing developments in León, Mexico, Guayaquil, Ecuador, and Caracas, Venezuela. Why and how aren't these examples reducing urban inequality? The first and obvious answer is that they are conceived to replace, not mitigate, the limitations of informal settlements, which are undeniably real and still growing. Informal settlements have not, in effect, been replaced, so how can such approaches continue to be presented as mitigations of inequality? Secondly, local authorities tend to simplify the structure of cities and conflate urbanism with housing. Jordi Borja, a Catalan urbanist who has been involved in numerous urban renewal processes, both in Europe and Latin America, states that from his experience, urban projects and other infrastructure projects tend to focus on a particular sector without maintaining a holistic urban vision. Priority is given to paving streets and housing. Thirdly, formal housing is not an economically viable response to address the magnitude of people in spontaneous communities, and this in and of itself should be enough to question its appropriateness as an official government strategy to address social needs. In 2014, Mexico reported a housing deficit of 9.7 million units. So that's the equivalent of 40 million people, a third of its population, despite enormous investments to increase the stock of homes between 2010 and 2014. There are no official reports on the current housing deficit in Caracas. People in the construction industry estimated as around 2.4 million homes in 2017. So 10 million people, nearly 30% of the country's population. Although massive emigration this past year has likely reduced this number. So even though we're talking about a third of the population in both examples, housing remains the most championed national strategy to address social inequality. Mexico continues to be a strong supporter of the housing agenda, and of course, there is a whole sector of the real estate enterprise to consider, focused on social housing projects supported by government agencies such as CONAVI and Infonavit through sizable subsidies. This investment is consistently justified in strategies that address poverty, with housing models designed by top Mexican architects. Here's an example of a recently built social housing project that is partly funded by CONAVI on the outskirts of León, Mexico. It has strived to include sustainable strategies and technologies, but it has not been conceived with urban integration or inclusion in mind. These are other similar examples in Cancun, Quintana Roo. A recent study I was hired to do for UN Habitat Mexico looks at how CONAVI could prioritize subsidies for projects located in inner city lots through the program Nama Urbana. And it remains to be seen the extent to which these suggestions will motivate change. In the Venezuelan case, sustained focus on housing is driven by propaganda. The Gran Misión Vivienda Venezuela program has supposedly served 2 million families, although the Cámara Inmobiliaria has only been able to document less than 8,000 apartments built in Caracas between 2011 and 2016. It is hard to imagine where the remaining 1,992,000 are located. In any case, here we see an image of Gran Misión Vivienda project in Playa Grande, state of Vargas, about 40 minutes from Caracas, near the coast. These homes were designed, shipped, and built by a Belarus building company. Ventilation has not been considered, even though the climate here is hot and humid. But that is secondary. What is important is buying the loyalty of people through the promise of receiving or earning through strong political affiliation an apartment at no cost. And as a side note, both the Mexican and Venezuelan projects have been repeatedly denounced for their scandalous levels of corruption and for the poor quality construction the poor quality of construction and the poor quality of services of the apartments built. Both examples operate under very different motivations, but they buy into the same positivist discourse and seem to confirm that the tool, in this case housing, has become the default approach to address underprivileged populations in many parts of the developing world. But when you look at cities through the lens of territorial inequality, such strategies are actually counterproductive, as they continue to define territory through internally homogeneous, separate, distinct enclaves. If or when the goal is framed to address urban inequality, we find there's a dearth of consequential and viable approaches. A new home does not mitigate existing urban exclusion, nor does it represent a relevant offer for people who may have a perfectly functional home that just happens to be in an informal settlement. The limitations of a home in an informal settlement have to do with exclusion, from urban dynamics, access to schools, health centers, jobs, public space, but not necessarily in the housing structure itself. And these exclusive aspects are not only physical, but also present in public policies and urban investments, how funds for public works are allocated, waste management, public services, etc. They are not equitably distributed. Fortunately, some cities in Latin America, including Rio de Janeiro, Medellin, Bogotá, and Guayaquil, have experienced nearly 3 decades of sustained experiences in informal settlement improvement. They have created a concrete spectrum of projects that begin to mitigate and dissolve territorial differences. Although the approaches among cities and within cities vary, one common denominator is that projects that include components of public space have had very notable effects in advancing urban integration, as in the case of the Malecón Salado in Guayaquil, Ecuador, and Chapo Mangueira in Rio de Janeiro. This is an image of Malecón Salado in Guayaquil, Ecuador. The project, built by the municipality, creates an urban front onto the river as a mechanism to control the encroachment of to control the encroachment of informal settlements into the estados. People would throw debris into the waterway to gain land, build their home over this very unsound foundation, and throw their sewage water and waste into the river. The project relocates and demolishes unstable homes and creates a boardwalk to contain further construction. The wastewater is collected separately, which has reduced the estado's pollution levels and even allowed water sports such as rowing to take place once again, and mangroves have also started to regrow. The boardwalk makes the neighborhood easier to navigate and is connected to other linear park systems along the waterway, so it increases accessibility and integration with the rest of the city, and it's what's highlighted in yellow. The second project is a natural reserve park above the favela Chapo Mangueira Babilonia in Rio de Janeiro. It is located just north of Copacabana Bay, so just to focus. So this is Copacabana Bay, it's up here, this is the water. And Copacabana would be this part, and here's Chapo Mangueira Babilonia. It's actually 2 favelas together. So you walk through the favela and ascend, and as you ascend, you reach the natural reserve park over the Morro. It was once completely deforested, and the community, with the encouragement of a civic organization, began a process of reforestation. Today, neighbors offer to guide visitors through the forest park to the top, where some of the most breathtaking views of Rio can be enjoyed. The Copacabana Beach, Flamingo Bay, Sugarloaf Mountain, and the Cristo on the Corcovado. Kids from the favela are often seen here flying kites. The favela becomes part of the entrance and passage towards the park, and in this sense begins to form part of an urban and recreational experience, both for locals and visitors. So this is the forest at the top. In these and other examples, first we see how public space interventions attenuate and weaken urban physical boundaries. They even integrate sectors of the city typically understood as opposites. At the same time, they require significantly less financial investment than housing projects. Secondly, public space within informal settlements also represents a common ground that can encourage or allow social cohesion among different citizens to develop. I don't mean social cohesion among members within the settlement, that is often already very strong, but I also mean among different urban inhabitants. Settlements are typically read as private enclaves, where outsiders feel very self-conscious. Open public space allows visitors from the rest of the city, as well as the community members, to share a common space. And third, the relevance of public space for informal settlements is not minor. On the contrary, the high densities, the monofunctional use typically associated to spontaneous communities, and the extreme scarcity of such spaces make them that much more significant. For example, Caracas is already notorious for its lack of public space, the last on the list of cities. 1 square meter per inhabitant, but the figure is 10 times worse within informal settlements. Petare, for example, only has 0.1 square meter per inhabitant. Informal communities are unquestionably underserved by public space. So Pure Space, Transformations of Public Space into Informal Settlements of Latin America, is an upcoming publication I have written together with my office, Enlace Arquitectura. It stems from research I began with the Wheelwright Fellowship, received in 2011, and will soon be a book edited by Akhtar with the support of the Graham Foundation and GAF. It highlights 23 experiences, and here we can see the draft of the index page. 2 of these projects were just mentioned earlier. They are all exemplars of public space projects in informal settlements that in one way or other advance urban integration. Although some of the projects included are part of official government programs, many have been financed through the private sector or supported by multilateral entities. As concrete-built projects that have successfully advanced territorial equality, they beg the question of what would happen if resources typically dedicated to new social housing projects were invested in strategies that integrate existing informal settlements to urban dynamics, especially through public space. The book's intention is to offer readers, including local authorities and urban investors, the opportunity to recognize the strategic value public space projects have in informal settlements as conduits that link different segments of the city, in addition to the advantages of their viability and low cost. They should be considered as operations to mitigate the territorial inequality present in cities and allow housing to shift towards other agendas. For example, ones focused on demographic segments of the population that can handle the financial constraints of formal housing, and in developing countries with greater per capita income, such as Chile. And now I'd like to share a bit of how our practice emerged and began this line of inquiry in terms of design, research, dissemination, and public policy. Our office is in Caracas, Venezuela, and started in 2007 when I moved there from Rome. During the first year, we worked on 3 projects that really set the tone for the years to come. The pavement and drainage of Sabana Grande Boulevard in Caracas, and it's where the red line is, was the result of a competition I won, and I say I instead of we because we really weren't, there wasn't an office to speak of yet, and unbelievably it got built. It is a pedestrian boulevard that traverses 1.6 kilometers of the city and coincides with 3 subway stations. It had been taken over by informal vendors during the early 2000s and was suddenly evacuated rather aggressively in 2006 by the government and renovated with funding from PDVSA, Venezuela's oil company. This experience brought us a great deal of insight on the pragmatic aspects of designing and building public space. So these are just various images during the construction. Difficult to build something while thousands of pedestrians are traversing this on a daily basis. And then Sabana Grande in use today. I also started working on the Media Legua Church, which is a rural setting in the state of Vargas, 2 hours from Caracas, roughly where the circle is. It's a pro bono project that has progressed very slowly at the pace of donations received and was only recently consecrated this past September. The church was built by members of the community, and it really does represent a tour de force for them. The place now represents the center of Media Legua for the community to use in a number of ways, and the open space in front of it will be configured into a multifunctional public plaza for people of all ages. There's more work to be done, building benches, light fixtures, and landscape, which I look forward to because each site visit has been the opportunity to learn about the value in rural habitat. I have gotten to know the community and had a chance to perceive the benefits of living in rural settings. Many of the neighbors actually once lived in Caracas and decided to move to the countryside in search of better quality of life. And this is where I started to understand the importance of reconsidering rural habitat as part of the informal settlement discourse. Doug Saunders ably discloses in his book Arrival City how in many respects informal settlements are the habitat for the family member that is working in the city and sending money back to his or her village. Venezuela is already a very urban country. 93% of the population lives in cities. In other words, rural-urban migration has already finished in Venezuela. But learning about the community of Media Legua, where many inhabitants actually left the city and returned to the countryside because they preferred its lifestyle, suggests that much greater consideration and resources should be focused on strengthening rural economies and their communities, together with the question of informal settlements. And the option studio I'm currently teaching at the GSD on the agency of Mezcal in the Oaxaca Valley speaks to this idea. The third project I started, literally the day after I arrived in Caracas, was focused on the informal settlement La Moran, which is the red dot, towards the western side of the city. For nearly a year, I just observed. I was frankly overwhelmed. I taught a design studio at the Central University of Venezuela that caught the attention of CAF, Development Bank of Latin America. They invited Enlace Arquitectura to present a project proposal for La Moran, and we were obliged to partner with an NGO in order to meet CAF's requirements. The proposal was approved, and we ventured into a holistic project that began with a census of the community, a topographical survey, social engagement of the community, mostly through meetings, and I have since grown very skeptical or more critical of this format, and a detailed recovery to sanitize a creek used to transport sewage water and address issues of waste management associated with clandestine dumps, making them into opportunities for public space. In the end, it only yielded a very modest neighborhood square built by the neighbors themselves, and the project came to a frustrating end. It did not gain the government's support, which in hindsight is not a surprise. CAF could go no further since their business is to provide loans for government projects that require the state's approval. And the project's financial counterpart, an NGO that collects contributions from sizable Venezuelan companies, the Dividendo Voluntario para la Comunidad, supposedly focused on strengthening communities, disengaged themselves completely from the initiative as they truly believed that such work was the sole responsibility of the government. Then I was fortunate enough to win the Wheelwright Fellowship from Harvard in 2011. At the moment, it really came as a blessing. I visited 6 cities in Latin America for an extended period, more than 40 informal settlements, and was again overwhelmed by the amount of information I had documented. But as it all settled and the intensity of my experience calmed, I realized that what most impressed me were the examples of public space I encountered as catalysts of notable urban change. We then synthesized the research into an exhibition, Pure Space, which was presented in 4 different cities, Caracas, Toronto, Miami, and Buenos Aires, and the contents soon will be published in May, as I mentioned earlier. We also embarked on an ambitious task of mapping the growth of informal settlements in Caracas through our project CABA, Cartography of the Caracas Barrios, which has been well received and is today an important reference for citizens at large, students, and researchers. It basically tells the story of how informal settlements grew over a 50-year period in Caracas, including data on the number of housing units, occupied area, population, and density in 4 distinct years. In many ways, it is a book about the parallel modern history of the city. So I'm going to just show a little bit how it works. The area in the red square is the most central and most historic part of the city. Here we see in green what were informal settlements in 46, and red is the Silencio project I mentioned earlier. Then in 57, many of the barrios were raised for the 23 de Enero project, the red dots. And between 57 and 66, they grew, as you see in the map. And this is more or less what happened in that area. So the left set picture is 23 de Enero and 58, and the right side is a more recent picture. These are other images in the book. This is El Valle, El Cementerio, Cota 905, San Agustín del Sur. You see that helicoide there on the right. It was also an exhibition that traveled to at least 7 sites, and we invited schools for workshops to talk about the city, where they live, what informal settlements are, and their proximity to references they know. We are keen to continue creating these educational opportunities for children to reflect on the built environment. I believe these research efforts not only helped us build stronger arguments against skeptics, such as the DVC, but they also gave us an edge and opened the door for opportunities to once again work with communities and create strategies to build public spaces with them. We were asked to join an NGO, FUDEP, with which we had worked before in La Moran, to embark on a project funded by the private sector, Citibank, so not the government. The program is called City Planting, as we basically started from scratch, designing methodologies to engage the community, create awareness regarding their surroundings, and begin to form ideas about how it could be transformed. We found that games and using outdoor spaces was much more successful in drawing people in than meetings. We also created simple designs for elements that make up public space: stairs, benches, canopies, swings, bus stop, pavement, using readily available and often recycled materials. And we also did a lot of planting with neighbors. Over the course of 3 years, we were able to work with 18 communities in Maracaibo, Valencia, and Caracas, and build 18 modest spaces with them. I will share 2 of these experiences in Caracas in 1916 and the other in 2016 and 2017. The first is La Ceiba, Barrio Unión Petar, in western side of Caracas. Eastern side of Caracas, I'm sorry. The Plaza Santa Rita was in many respects already being used as a de facto public space, with a basketball court cobbled together over an inclined surface and an improvised bus station. So basically, that's what you see right here. These jeeps, as they call them, gather there and wait for passengers. We began a series of activities, much like the ones in the photographs I just shared. And then we went on to formulating the project with the community. And their concern was to open the space up to more segments of the population so that not only teenagers could play basketball, but also smaller children could feel it was their own. Now they make a beeline straight to the slide, stand in line, and go down again and again. We made it purposefully steep, and the cement is very slick, so it's a really good slide. There are benches with that will be shaded at some point with trees we planted for parents and senior citizens to gather. And a canopy is in a protected area, so this is what it looked like originally and what it looks like now, where children can play hopscotch on pavement patterns made with recycled bottle caps they helped build. You can maybe make out a little bit of it here in the bottom. But it is also a place for outdoor movies projected onto a neighbor's sidewall, and a place for religious ceremonies and community markets. The second project is in La Palomera, towards the southern part of the city. And this time the community focused on, so this is La Palomera. And this time the community focused on a waste dump that's roughly right here, that had been there for 30 years. And so the project centered on waste management and the transformation of the space into a modest plaza. It also was part of a larger kind of idea, but this is really where the project that was built is focused. The design includes a pavement motif out of recycled bottle caps that allowed children to participate, as well as, and so this is all the kids participating that day, as well as a colorful bench made of wood pallets from recycled pallets that a carpenter, Señor Augusto, helped us build, and they were painted by the children. Finally, beans were planted by a neighbor just in front of the fence that separates it from the basketball court, and within a few months, the beans grew and provide shade during the afternoon hours. After 18 small projects, 6 every year, we were able to gain a lot of experience in identifying which strategies were allowing us to better communicate with the community. We also produced significant transformations, not only physical ones, but also in the community's sense of self-worth. And it is fantastic to listen to Señora Martina, who's lived in La Palomera 60 years, tell the story of how her new plaza was made. However, we became increasingly worried and aware of the fact that this work remained insular, and felt the next step would be to forge opportunities for people from the rest of the city to know and experience, for example, La Ceiba or La Palomera. Informal settlement inhabitants circulate throughout the entire city regularly. The challenge is also to build bridges that give everyone else reasons to visit the barrio and incorporate these places into their mental urban maps. We found an opportunity to explore a more artistic and ephemeral approach through an annual event called El Calvario, and the Calvario is the red dot at the bottom, El Calvario Puertas Abiertas, which is an initiative Chio Carvajal, an important urban activist in Caracas, started a few years ago. It is meant to celebrate the Barrio El Calvario and open its doors to visitors through a series of activities led by the community and planned for a particular day in December, which is a religious holiday, La Paradura del Niño, that the community traditionally celebrated with music and dancing. For its third edition, last year, we chose to celebrate a path through El Calvario that would lead people from the Simón Bolívar Square, so this is colonial fabric in the city, and there's the Simón Bolívar Square, and would lead you through a path up to Plaza La Cruz, where a live band plays and people dance. It was meant to serve as a series of clues or links that would encourage visitors to find all 7 canopies suspended over the path. It also played off of the artistic character of the electric wires that commonly crisscross the sky. We invited people to upload photographs with the hashtag Cubierta El Calvario to social media so that others might grow curious and decide to come see the canopies themselves in El Calvario. We're also exploring ways to alter the way we work with communities through 3 new projects we were invited to design and build with another NGO called Mi Convive, as part of a program funded by the Swiss Embassy in Venezuela. Among Mi Convive's many projects, one important one is a network of soup kitchens for children, an initiative called Alimenta la Solidaridad that is close to reaching 60 such centers, all privately funded. We're currently working with 3 of these spaces in 3 different informal settlements. They are Chapellín, La Vega, and Antímano. These are all closely linked to the soup kitchens, and what we're experimenting now is getting more quickly to the moment of building the public space with the community so that we can continue working with them once the spaces are built. Basically have more time post-construction to accompany the community to use, maintain, and program these spaces. We also want to plan activities that will draw larger audiences from surrounding areas. The project that is furthest along is in Chapellín, a space ill-used and in poor condition. It was chosen by the community to be restored and made into a more functional place. We eliminated a 1-meter difference, so you can see sort of where the ramp and the motorcycle is trying to get up, in the pavement that cut through the center of the plaza and leveled it so that basketball games could be played and also processions and other activities could take place more comfortably. So this is how it begins in meetings, and just for fun, maybe you guys can find the Swiss ambassador that came to the meeting that day. He's clearly the tallest one in the group. These are images during the construction. It's ongoing right now. We haven't finished yet. And an image of it, how it is just last Friday. Another project in Antímano will focus on eliminating a waste dump with an integral waste management program and convert this steep slope into a series of slides for children. As you can see, it's where people have also learned to leave their waste. And here are the children overseeing their project as it's getting built. A year ago, we registered our own NGO, Enlace Fundación, in order to be able to explore other types of projects, programs, and write our own proposals for funding. We also want to channel future research and dissemination efforts through this entity, as well as initiatives focused on influencing public policy. Through private donations, we have started to configure new public spaces along the southern ridge of La Palomera. So there's La Palomera again. And this entire ridge here really has a lot of potential. These are early kind of sketches on what it could configure, and these are images of different points along that ridge. So we chose it for the obvious potential it has and for the relationship we already have with the community. The first intervention addresses the issues of vehicles occupying important free spaces. This is kind of contradictory, so we don't have any space for public space, but we have space for parking cars. So we were able to negotiate moving 5 cars in order to create a modest playground under an existing jabillo tree, which is translated as a possum tree. Here we are talking to neighbors and showing them how cars can be rearranged to create space under the tree. And in this slide, this is our meeting with the car owners. They at first were not so keen on moving their parking spaces, but we managed to negotiate a compromise, and with their approval, then opened a public meeting where the community would ultimately decide on the proposal. Over the past 5 months, inflation has gotten much worse in the country, and the money we had raised will no longer be enough to cover the park's cost. Nonetheless, we have started with the perimeter bench, and this is really important to the community because there's it's a kind of a high level change after it. And so we started with the construction nonetheless, and in order to save money, we're filling the formwork with plastic bottles to allow us to use less concrete. In January this year, we formally presented a proposal to the U.S. Embassy in Venezuela to support a program that would essentially take them for the first time into an informal settlement in Caracas. And 9 months later, we feel very fortunate that it was approved. And we have now basically hit the ground running. The project is titled Urban Awareness and will take place in La Palomera, giving us a chance to explore new approaches toward many of the issues regarding urban integration that we have already been discovering. For example, we will have a lecture series in La Palomera under the title Art, Pedagogy, and the City, and we will promote this event throughout the city to encourage widespread participation. And we will be collaborating with a number of other civic organizations in the city. We are also planning an exhibition that brings together ideas that the municipality, academia, and the community itself have worked on over the years. We'll also include a 1:100 scale model, so a really big one, of La Palomera, and the intention is to create scenarios for shared conversation regarding the settlement itself, but more importantly, how it is perceived, approached, and integrated with its surroundings. And lastly, we will curate an open-air museum where artists and the community will freely express reflections and critiques on the nature of integration, or the lack thereof, that is experienced in La Palomera. And artists, a French-American artist, Justine Graham, and Venezuelan artists will participate in the Rearranged architecture tour that links Baruta Center, which is formal, and La Palomera, as an experience that links both fabrics. I also believe it is important to take advantage of this research and experience to shape public policy, which is currently very weak or somewhat outdated with respect to informal settlements. Much was done toward incorporating the city's barrios into the overall urban discourse in the 90s by Josefina Baldó and Federico Villanueva through the Plan de Habilitación Física de Barrios. But its focus was on improvement, not integration, and somehow oddly it advocates strategies more appropriate of car-centered urbanism. Times are now different, and we have very little resources and an obvious division structured into the city. And so to that end, we organized a 3-day workshop with the Metropolitan Municipality titled AICA, Actions for the Integration of Caracas. And we focused on Barrio Unión, which is this one over here we saw earlier, and La Palomera. And the results, after meeting urban planning experts, people from the community, architects, urban designers, we came with a consensual list of actions that would further integration. And I just want to sort of share what we mean. It's not very important or big infrastructure investments. Sometimes just the entrance to the barrio, for example, here in La Palomera, is the place where waste is collected. And so it's a very strong statement that as you go from formal city into the barrio, you first have to traverse these containers of waste. And just logistical changes could create a very big impression. Currently, so these are kind of images of what those entrances could look like. Currently, we are working with to make another meeting of experts as part of the embassy project, and we hope that this will move public policy along at the Baruta municipality level, but also national government. It was once stipulated by Congress in the 90s that 6% of the nation's funds should be allocated towards informal settlement improvement. We want to revisit this law and suggest amendments to it, with the intention of shaping new public policy that considers public space making as an investment to advance urban integration. We would eventually present it for consideration in a legitimate National Assembly when and if future scenarios allow it. So now to end. Up against such compromised circumstances in Venezuela, the mere gesture of formulating alternative urban interventions through civic forces and more modest resources could seem marginal at best, or even naive. Today, the work we do is perhaps no longer a logical consequence of our interests and research, but an obstinate and even stubborn survival effort. The truth is that getting through each day has become so challenging, people no longer interiorize what is happening. Rather, everyone has learned to cohabitate with hardship through any and all available defense mechanisms. Among them, there is one Federico Vegas, a famous Venezuelan writer who is also an architect, recently narrated in his article Fascination, which is astonishment or stupefaction that simply paralyzes. He argues that news today on what is happening in Venezuela is so absurd and extravagant that one remains entranced or hypnotized. Fascination is juxtaposed with attention, where the first is passive engagement that constantly seeks out new stimuli, much like an addiction, so being hooked on Twitter searching for the next alarming occurrence. Attention is connected to discovery and a readiness to formulate questions and find answers. He cites that according to Catherine Lecuyer, a Canadian child psychologist, screens, so iPads and phones, cause fascination in children. They are drawn by the stimuli and become addicted, which is why more creative activities such as painting, building blocks, and playing outside are encouraged instead. Vegas suggests that creativity and the audacity to work for a future reality is a way to break the spell of a very trying present and forge resilience. By creating opportunities to build pilot public space projects, rehearse methodologies for community engagement, draft public policy, and increase awareness, we feel this time will not have been spent in vain. Caracas and so many other cities will need to undergo integration processes, we hope sooner than later. Faced with the growing inequality that so flagrantly threatens social cohesion, peace, and environmental sustainability, how can we not recognize the obvious Cassandras that summon us to do everything possible, each from our own discipline and space, so that through the small alterations we introduce into our unfolding history, perhaps our contemporary Troy isn't lost altogether. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elisa. This is wonderful. The best introduction would have been the most audacious designer one can imagine. Really, I'm so glad you mentioned in the end the hardship, because she is moving mountains every day as she designs and has the audacity to think of the future. We have time for questions, so please feel free. We will pass the microphone.
I'm going to take the first question since I control the microphone. Early in your talk, you showed maybe your first image of a community meeting, and you mentioned that you have grown, I can't remember the word you used, but disillusioned with that format, or maybe unconvinced that that format produces a good result. Could you talk a little bit about, or just talk more about that, sort of what's led you to those feelings, and maybe what other approaches you might apply going forward?
Well, just the meeting format is very hierarchical in its essence. And essentially, 10 years ago, I didn't have the kind of the tools to really be able to identify that what was happening was kind of a giving information, and the counterparts just receiving it, and it's very intimidating for them to actually participate. Some are very well versed and leaders in the community and don't have issues with it, but you don't get the input from other people. I remember Marty Poitier's lecture last time, this thing of with the dice that was rolled so that somebody else would participate who normally might have not been the first one. You get none of that in meeting settings. So what we started to do with the city planting project was games, and also more people from our side there to, be with people on a kind of a closer one-to-one basis. And what is most interesting are the comments that come out, during the game or in between the game, and just being closer to them somehow opens their creativity even, and they do feel, I think, less intimidated to participate and speak. That's kind of the reason.
The first power of your work is the beautiful projects that are made and seeing the people using the projects. But the second power of the work is, in each case, a different or new structure has to be made between different people, different. You mentioned at one point private, NGOs, public, and these versions all require their different structures to create a project. And then we saw the woman who had lived 60 years in the particular barrio. So it seems to me that these, I don't know what to call them, let's call them templates or project structures, are themselves a design, themselves a work, and shouldn't be in a drawer, but somehow might even be passed around as a kind of samizdat literature for recreating a public city, a commons. And that's what struck me very strongly, that you have done these, that you have a collection of these. And in your book, you talked a little bit, you showed at the end sort of a policy conclusion about it. Do you see it that way, or do you see that this is material that should be circulated or made known, or?
Yes, I thank you for that, Alex, and feel very strongly about the importance of dissemination and publishing in different formats, which is why we've done exhibitions on a lot of the work we've been doing progressively, and then trying to get them into books. So hopefully at some point there will be an opportunity to take these methods as projects themselves. I very much agree. It's very laborious, and they've been tested. So that's and as we test them, we change them. So it would be worthwhile to record them. We have talked about this with the last Mi Convive project. They've been a fantastic counterpart to work with. And I know they're very eager to kind of get this into something that is useful for others to just, not reinvent the wheel always, but just gain a position from adapting or frankly just taking some of the strategies we've used. But as far as public policy goes, it's a moot point at this stage. There is no person to converse with in the government right now. But there is a lot of kind of underground political activity going on in younger generations, which is fantastic. People trying to, do things, but stay low-key enough to not, get themselves in prison, basically. And I cringe when I think that if, because we have had in the past very important, big agendas with a lot of money behind it to do things in the city. So Misión Vivienda was, I don't know, billions of dollars. None of this is published, so I can't really say a precise figure. But before that, the Plan de Habilitación Física de Barrios, which I mentioned, was a very important program in the 90s that David Gubernier, who's teaching at UPenn, was able to kind of put together, and these two key architects, I don't really coincide with their strategies, but they did do a lot, and there were competitions and all sorts of things. So my thought is, I would hate to sort of not have done the groundwork to create a situation when one comes again that is, current and not taking out of drawers these past projects that didn't really have a focus that's more in the spirit of these times. So the Plan de Habilitación Física de Barrios was about organizing the community and joining housing units into a kind of a condominium structure, which has many interesting advantages. And it was also about taking a road through them. So relocating like 300 homes and things that we just know today are socially not viable. I'm close with several of the people that won the elections to be in the Congress. That entity has since been sort of brushed aside, but they know a lot, and so the idea is for us to work together and have something pretty well massaged. Yeah.
Hi. You mentioned you formed your own NGO foundation last year,
Yeah.
right? And I was wondering how you see the relationship between your design firm and your NGO in public policy, and how they inform each other, what challenges they face individually, but also as a collective, their relationship and how you see it work and play out in the larger environment.
Yeah, well, in many ways, I think we have been operating as what you would conventionally associate more with an NGO. I mean, research and exhibitions, and most of this work, it is not compensated in a way that you would call it typical of an office, So the structure is not really any different internally in the office, but what the foundation allows us to do is to, comply with the requirements to be able to compete for grants and this sort of thing. That's the honest reason is it's more of a legal one. But I think also in the end it'll help us position the different projects, because we do have some that are more conventional, a hotel in Aruba doesn't really fit into this. So it would help us, parcel out the projects in a more coherent way. Yeah.
Thank you so much for everything that you shared today. I was just curious, I appreciated your provocation at the end of thinking about the need for integration in so many cities and the spatial inequality that exists. And I was just curious if you could offer some reflections on what this would look like in the US context, or maybe in Boston, what some interventions come to mind that you think would be effective.
That's a really good question. Well, I think, for example, that the Emerald Necklace just does that in a really beautiful way. I mean, so many of these neighborhoods towards the south maybe now are, gentrified, but they were, when I was here as a student, pretty shabby places, and yet, they had access to this fantastic park. So I'm not trained as a landscape architect, but I certainly have a whole lot more faith on those kind of strategies to achieve integration in cities than I do others, I should say. But I don't know, I'm thinking of like the St. Louis studio that Daniel Doca is doing. Again, focused on the Third Ward apparently, and I was born and raised in St. Louis, and I can say that I actually don't really know the structure of the city enough to be able to say how it would work. But I think the issue would be to just, look at its boundaries and look at what's next to it and make a concerted effort to not just sort of think of the center of those places, but really to think about what's going on at the hinges that it has with the next place, so that it flows and you don't, abruptly feel like you're passing from one place into another within the city.
Thank you. That was incredible, no? And inspiring. I was thinking, I'm more familiar with colonias in Mexico City, but I was thinking about, what do you think about the role of the resources, for instance, water, that it's so important as a supply, and that falls for free from the sky, and all these, strategies that make people kind of trying to transform the urban environment in order to harvest, to make them stronger, because in fact they have, sometimes we think that is the public space, but sometimes it's the resources that they can get for free that empower them in energy or supplies,
Yeah. Very good question. There's kind of two sides of the water. So be more resourceful with rainwater, for example. And I have an example that I think does that quite well in Mexico, in a colonia, and maybe that's the one you're thinking of. But also just services. Like often you'll get the question, well, why is public space important if people don't have access to water or so forth? And quite frankly, in Venezuela, that just my own experience has made it a less important point in terms of integration. Where I live in Altamira, which is a pretty nice part of the city, water's rationed, and we get it in the building half an hour in the morning and half an hour in the evening. So we're kind of at the same level of the rest of the city in that respect. But there is a project in Miravalle in Mexico City that does just that. It's on the lower part of a volcano, and I don't, Ixtapalapa, or so, I can't.
Iztapalapa.
Yeah. And so the thing there that's key is that it had a religious organization, so Marinista school, and they live in the community, and they're very kind of progressive. So they've managed to, with the community, get all these projects along that have to do with recovering, so water that comes from the volcano side into there's a large public space just at the base of it that I visited just before going with my students actually to Oaxaca. I kind of did a detour there, and they have been able to get funding from the government. The government has these like participatory budgets. So if you do a really good job presenting your project, you can get some funds from the government. And also Deutsche Bank financed a lot of what they did. And then they have a kind of a demonstrative space that shows what you do with this water. So they collect it, they have cisterns, they have pumps that they have attached to bicycles. So you just get on the bicycle, pump the water. There are sorts of a series of greenhouses, agricultural fields. They have I think it's even a fish pond trying to show how you could cultivate fish. I mean, it's fantastic. And I think, yes, that these kind of examples need to further proliferate themselves, absolutely. Because it's public space, but it's didactic and it's productive as well. And you learn to have this different conscience about water resources. Yeah. Do you know the project?
No,
Yeah,
I didn't know the project. Do you know Isla Urbana?
No, I don't know that one. Yeah,
It's like also two students going back to Mexico and then starting this way of like really, really small tools to harvest your water and purify it, and they go around because the government start investing on them because invest more money on water trucks because during 6 months of the year they need to, in Iztapalapa for instance, I did a studio there and I know people in there. So it's interesting because now these type of initiatives for them, at least for the Mexico government, are getting more fun because at the end, like water trucks are more expensive. So if you give them kind of water independence, you empower them to, you can, yes, because the investment is at the beginning and then you can invest in other things. The problem is that they keep investing on moving water there, and they have to go and take the water in a bucket and go back home. It's like incredible, no? Yeah. Water is because it's so related to landscape, but also that. Yeah.
Thank you, Elisa. I think this is more a comment, and I want to say that I think we find in the world now what seemingly insurmountable problems. We're all asking, how do we fix it? And I think the answer is you. I think that what you've demonstrated is that in the face of power, what you do is you be smarter, and and so you've eloquently shown how you define a problem, because if you don't define the problem, we don't understand how to fix it. And you've woven a beauty through your work too. And so I think that I'm just excited to watch what's going to happen, because it's people like you that are going to fix the world. So thank you.
So my question has to do with the future. Here we have, as you said, the Emerald Necklace and all of these sort of integrative landscapes that have organized so much of the city and its culture. They also, with them came institutions, private and public, to protect them and to sustain them over time. What is going to protect these landscapes over time so that they do continue its job of integrating?
So yes, this is why we're so keen now on getting to be able to make the public spaces with them earlier, so that we can now kind of really deal with this second part of the issue, which is completely germane. And for example, the Sucre municipality about 10 years ago, when I first got to Venezuela, Carlos Ocariz and his then wife were making all sorts of public spaces inside Petare and designing them with the university and a lot of paint, which I'm not such a big fan of, but and one of the spaces that we included in our program was one that was completely abandoned. It was not working anymore, only like 6 years later. And this was pretty alarming. So what we found was that it was a program, the way that this is kind of a lot of insider information, but the way that the mayor was focusing on it is, I need to get them down fast. One park is the equivalent of a patrol car in cost, and so they need to crank them out fast and, show that we're doing something. No attention. This is systemic of the country, as you know. No attention to maintenance or not even community engagement in the process. So the project we did with FUDEP as part of Sembrando Ciudad was, really taking a good deal of time to talk to the people. What didn't work? What is the kind of programs that you need? Who are the people that would come here? And then, so you design the project with them. So that's, I think, one big guarantee. So it is exactly what they dreamed of or hoped for with the money constraints that we have. And that program, we just kind of got to that point because it was such a struggle within a year to even get to that much. So we are looking now at finding ways for the community to really be kind of one-on-one directly associated with the project. So for example, in the Tepellín one, I've been so adamant about including greenery because it's just pavement. And the neighbors don't want it. They're like, people urinate in them. I don't want a planting. And I've just kept at it. And finally, we found that the ministry has imposed on schools to have urban huertos, urban plots of agriculture. Well, agriculture is a big word. Urban plots of vegetables. And so, and she doesn't have a place to do it. So we're doing this correlation. Okay, these will be the children's huertos or vegetable gardens. And we're going to have a name tag with every single one of the plants for the children, and they will go and they'll take care of them. So this is something that kind of spontaneously occurred. So the plantings will be the responsibility of the school to take care of and upkeep, and we just hope to be able to find things like this that are already somehow needs that the community has that will be able, but in no way depend on the municipality to fund any of this or the government. It really has to come from the community. Just, we don't have structures that are, institutions are even weaker now, as you know, so yeah. That's a big anecdote, but yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.